1. Greetings. Welcome to Journey Through the Bible. This is Father Paul Joseph at St. Margaret Mary Catholic Church in Lomita. I want to welcome everybody as we continue our journey through the sacred scriptures, recognizing the message of the inspired word of God. We're going to continue with the first book of Samuel, beginning with chapter 18. So let's begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good and gracious God, once again, we give you thanks for this opportunity to journey through the sacred scriptures, your inspired word. Today, we continue to hear about the first kings of the Jewish people. King Saul, who did not work out very well, and now David is anointed king, and he will eventually take his place. And we continue to recognize that there's only one king in our lives. You, our loving God, who guides us in our journey of faith. We take a moment to recognize those blessings in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Welcome back, everybody. It's good to be back with you, even though it still is on the computer, on the YouTube. As I said, we're continuing with the first book of Samuel in the Old Testament. Last time, we talked about how the people had asked Samuel for a king, and Samuel said, no, God is your only king. No, all the other countries around us have a king. Samuel, we need a king. So he selected Saul. And again, this is not St. Paul of the New Testament. This is a different person, Saul, who lived over 1,000 years before Jesus did. Well, Saul didn't always follow God's will. And actually, he had more of an interest in himself than in God and God's people. So as a result, David is anointed king, and Saul begins to realize it. But what happens is David is still a young boy. Saul is a man, full-grown man. Well, what happened is there was a conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines, and they decided to settle it by having one soldier, one fighter from each of the groups go against each other, and that would determine the outcome. Well, the Philistines obviously had Goliath, the giant, the most powerful man with all the great armor and the swords and the weapons. And the Israelites are trying to figure out what to do. David steps forth and says, I'm the one who wants to do this. And they said, this isn't really going to work well for you, David. He says, no, the Lord is with me. So if you recall, at the end of chapter 17 and verse 48, again, this is first book of Samuel, chapter 17, verse 48. The Philistine, Goliath, then moved to meet David at close quarters, while David ran quickly toward the battle line in the direction of the Philistine. David put his hand into the bag and took out a stone, hurled it with the sling, and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone embedded itself in his brow, and he fell prostrate on the ground. Thus David overcame the Philistine with sling and stone. He struck the Philistine mortally, and he did it without a sword. Then David ran and stood over him with the Philistine's own sword, which he drew from its sheath. He dispatched him and cut off his head. So what happened is David has done something so amazingly here. He is now the hero of the people. And as a result, Saul is not exactly as happy as we would anticipate. Well, now we're going to begin with our section today on chapter 18. So I'm just setting the setting here. David has been anointed king. Saul is still in power. David has killed Goliath. And now we proceed. First book of Samuel, chapter 18, verse 1. By the time David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan, the son of Saul, had become as fond of David as if life depended on him. He loved him as he loved himself. Saul laid claim to David that day and did not allow him to return to his father's house. And Jonathan entered into a bond with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan divested himself of the mantle he was wearing and gave it to David along with his military dress and his sword and his bow and his belt. It's an idea of here. It's just like a sports figure gives somebody your jersey after a game. That's what he's doing here. David then carried out successfully every mission on which Saul sent him. So Saul put him in charge of his soldiers, and this was agreeable to the whole army, even to Saul's own officers. Now, at this time, things are going well between David and Saul because Saul does not know that David has been anointed king. Verse 6, at the approach of Saul and David, on David's return from slaying the Philistine, women came out from each of the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, joyful songs and sistrums. The women played and sang. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Now, notice what's happening here. Saul has slain his thousands, a great military leader. But guess what? This kid David has effectively killed tens of thousands because he killed the giant Goliath. Verse 8. Saul was very angry and resentful of the song, for he thought, they give David 10,000s, but only thousands to me. All that remains for him is the kingship. And from that day on, Saul was jealous of David. As you can see, this is not going to work out well for Saul. The next day, an evil spirit from God came over Saul, and he raged in his house. David was in attendance, playing the harp as at other times, while Saul was holding his spear. Saul poised the spear, thinking to nail David to the wall, but twice David escaped him. Saul figures, I've got a problem. I'll solve it with violence. Verse 12. Saul then began to fear David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul himself. And the reason that they're saying that the Spirit had departed from Saul is that Saul had abandoned the way of the Lord. Therefore, the Lord no longer guided him. Verse 13. Accordingly, Saul removed him from his presence by appointing him a field officer. So David led the people on their military expeditions and prospered in all his enterprises, for the Lord was with him. Seeing how successful he was, Saul conceived a fear of David. On the other hand, all Israel and Judah loved him since he led them on their expeditions. So Saul is now fading into the background here. David is stepping forward. Verse 17, Saul said to David, there is my older daughter Merab, whom I will give you in marriage if you become my champion and fight the battles of the Lord. Saul had in mind, I shall not touch him. Let the Philistines strike him. The idea, I'll put him in the most dangerous situations in exchange for my daughter as his wife. The Philistines will kill him. We're all resolved. Verse 18, but David answered Saul, who am I? And who are my kin or my father's clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law? However, when it was time for Saul's daughter Merab to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel, the Metholite, instead. And what's going on here? Shuffling musical chairs, if you will. Verse 20. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and it was reported to Saul, who was pleased at this, for he thought, I will offer her to him to become a snare for him so that the Philistines may strike him. He's going to do it again. Hey, there we go. I'll put him out there. He'll get killed. That'll be it. Thus, for the second time, Saul said to David, you shall become my son-in-law today. Saul then ordered his servants to speak to David privately and say, the king is fond of you, and all his officers love you. You should become the king's son-in-law. Oh, doesn't that sound great? Verse 23. When Saul's servants mentioned this to David, he said, do you think it is easy to become the king's son-in-law? I am poor and insignificant. Remember, he was the one that took care of the animals when he was called to be king. Verse 14. When his servants reported to him the nature of David's answer, Saul commanded them to say this to David. The king desires no other price for the bride than the foreskins of 100 Philistines, that he may thus take vengeance on his enemies. Now we're thinking on first reading that he wants them all to convert to Judaism and then therefore all become Hebrews and therefore become circumcised. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that ain't going to happen. What's going to happen here is that he's asking him basically for these 100 foreskins, indicating he wants them to kill 100 Philistines and then bring the foreskins as proof. Saul intended in this way to bring about David's death to the Philistines. Sound familiar? When the servants reported this offer to David, he was pleased with this prospect of becoming the king's son-in-law. Before the year was up, David made preparations and sallied forth with his men and slew 200 Philistines. Remember, he asked for 100 and he killed 200. He brought back their foreskins and counted them out before the king, that he might thus become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. Saul thus came to recognize that the Lord was with David. The Lord has abandoned Saul. He is with David, and now Saul recognizes. Saul, verse 28. Saul thus came to recognize that the Lord was with David. Besides, his own daughter, Michal, loved David. Therefore, Saul feared David all the more and was his enemy after that. Now we've really got the tension between the two. Verse 30. The Philistine chiefs continued to make forays, but each time they took the field, David was more successful against them than any other of Saul's officers, and the result required great fame. Look at this. David is doing great. Saul is fading out into the background, or you would think. Chapter 19. Saul discussed his intention of killing David with his son Jonathan and with all of his servants. But Saul's son Jonathan, who was very fond of David, told him, "My father Saul is trying to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard tomorrow morning. Get out of sight and remain in hiding. I, however, will go out and stand beside my father in the countryside where you are, and I will speak to him about you. If I learn anything, I will let you know." So now in the rest of this chapter 19, they get into this big discussion about what they're going to do. This war breaks out. There's a big conflict between them. And what happens is in verse 8, when the war broke out, David went out to fight against the Philistines and inflicted a great defeat upon them, putting them to flight. Then an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with spear in hand, and David was playing the harp nearby. Saul tried to nail David to the wall with a spear, but David eluded Saul, so that the spear struck only the wall, and David got away safe. Once again, Saul is trying to solve his problem with violence. Verse 11. The same night, Saul sent messengers to David's house to guard it, that he might kill him in the morning. David's wife, Michal, informed him, "Unless you save yourself tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." Then Michal let David down through a window, and he made his escape in safety. And what happens here is Michal makes these excuses. "Oh, David is sick. Oh, he's not here. Let me go." When verse 18, thus David got away safely. He went to Samuel in Ramah, informing him of all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to stay in the sheds. When Saul was told that David was in the sheds near Ramah, he sent messengers to arrest David. When they saw the band of prophets, presided over by Samuel, in a prophetic frenzy, they too fell into the prophetic state. Informed of this, Saul sent other messengers who also fell into the prophetic state. For the third time, Saul sent messengers, but they too fell into the prophetic state. What's happening here is God is having control and power over them so that Saul cannot kill David. Well, then in the rest of chapter 19, Saul then wants to Ramah himself. They get into this big conflict. And then in chapter 20, verse 1, David fled from the sheds near Ramah and went to Jonathan. And he asked, "What have I done? What crime or offense does your father hold against me that he seeks my life?" David really didn't understand why Saul was so angry with him. Yes, David knew that he would eventually become king, but he wasn't in any big hurry. But it was out of jealousy that Saul continued to try and kill him. Well, as we go, there's all this struggle between them. Jonathan, the son of Saul, the king, is trying to help David, who is going to be the new king, and they go into this whole plan here. So in verse 8, "Do this kindness for your servant because of the Lord's bond between us and to which you brought me. If I'm guilty, kill me yourself. Why should you give me up to your father?" But Jonathan answered, "Not I. If I ever find out that my father is determined to inflict injury upon you, I will certainly let you know." David then asked Jonathan, "Who will tell me if your father gives you a harsh answer?" Well, again, it's in this great conflict that's going on between David and Saul, where Saul's son Jonathan is coming in to try and make peace. And the way that he's trying to make peace is by protecting David. And in the rest of chapter 20 here, from verse 11 on, we talked about the idea of this relationship between Jonathan and David and this conflict that Jonathan has with his father Saul. So as a result, on verse 24, David went to hide. David hid in the open country. On the day of the new moon, when the king sat at table to dine, taking his usual place against the wall, Jonathan sat facing him, while Abner sat at the king's side, and David's place was vacant. He's not here, he's in hiding. Verse 26. Saul, however, said nothing that day, for he thought he must have become unclean by accident and has not been cleansed. He must have touched a dead body, or he must have done something else that would render him unclean. Therefore, he can't come. That was his excuse. Verse 27. On the next day, the second day of the month, David's place was vacant again. Saul inquired of his son Jonathan, "Why is the son of Jesse not come to table yesterday or today?" Jonathan answered Saul, "David urgently asked me to let him go to his city of Bethlehem." And that's where he was, of the house of David, the city of Bethlehem. And he's telling his father that David is going to go there to pray. He's basically trying to keep from getting killed. Well, then again, they get into this big conflict. Verse 30, but Saul was extremely angry with Jonathan and said to him, "Son of a rebellious woman, I do not know that to your own shame and the disclosure of your mother's shame, you are a companion of Jesse's son?" He's figured out here that Jonathan is helping David. Verse 31. "Why, as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the earth, you cannot make good your claim to the kingship. So send for him and bring him to me, for he is doomed." But Jonathan asked his father Saul, "Why should he die? What has he done?" At this, Saul brandished his spear to strike him, and thus Jonathan learned that his father was resolved to kill King David. Jonathan sprang up from the table in great anger and took no food that second day of the month. He was grieved on David's account, since his father had rallied against him. You really feel for Jonathan in this situation. He's trying to be loyal to his father, but also to protect his friend. Verse 35. The next morning, Jonathan went out into the field with a little boy for his appointment with David. There he said to the boy, "Run and fetch the arrow." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him in the direction of the city. When the boy made for the spot where Jonathan had shot the arrow, Jonathan called after him, "The arrow is farther on." Again he called to his lad, "Hurry, be quick, don't delay." Jonathan's boy picked up the arrow and brought it to his master. The boy knew nothing. Only Jonathan and David knew what this meant. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to this boy of his and said to him, "Go, take them to the city." When the boy had left, David rose from beside the mound and prostrated himself on the ground 3 times before Jonathan on homage. It was the idea of he's respecting Jonathan because Jonathan is doing all that he can to help protect him. Chapter 21. Then David departed on his way, while Jonathan went back into the city. Now, this next part, verse 2, is something that we hear read during Sunday Mass once every 3 years, and it has making reference to when the apostles were going to eat the holy bread on the Sabbath day, and the Sadducees and the Pharisees were all upset with Jesus because of him doing that. So what Jesus does is he refers to this passage in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 2. David went to Ahimelech, the priest of Nob, who came trembling to meet him and asked, "Why are you alone? Is there no one with you?" David answered the priest, "The king gave me a commission and told me to let no one know anything about the business on which he has sent me or the commission he gave me. For that reason, I've arranged a meeting place with my men. Now, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves or whatever you can find." But the priest replied to David, "I have no ordinary bread on hand, only the holy bread. If the men have abstained from women, you may eat some of that." David answered the priest, "We have indeed been segregated from women as on previous occasions. Whenever I go on a journey, all the young men are consecrated, even for a secular journey, a non-religious journey. All the more so today, when they are consecrated at arms." So the priest gave him holy bread, for no other bread was on hand except the showbread, which had been removed from the Lord's presence and replaced by fresh bread when it was taken away. One of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, and he was Saul's chief henchman. Now, I'm bringing this out because remember the story in the gospel where the disciples were hungry and wanted to eat the bread on the Sabbath day, and that everybody was upset with them. Well, that's why Jesus makes reference to this, verse 7. So the priest gave him holy bread, for no other bread was on hand, except the showbread, which had been removed from the Lord's presence and replaced by fresh bread when it was taken away. So this is all part of Jesus fulfilling what had happened with David. Now, this next passage, verse 8, we get to hear about somebody who's going to really stir things up, and his name is Doeg of Edom. One of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, and he was Saul's chief henchman. This guy's going to turn out to be a problem. Verse 9. Then David then asked Ahimelech, do you have a spear or sword on hand? I brought along neither my sword nor my weapons, because the king's business was urgent. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of the Terebinth, is here wrapped in a mantle behind an ephod. If you wish to take it, take it. There is no sword here except that one. David said, there is none to match it. Give it to me. Remember, David killed Goliath with the stone in his sling. Now he's going to get his sword. Verse 11. That same day, David took to flight from Saul, going to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said, is this not David, the king of the land? During their dances, do they not sing? Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. The word of the reputation of David is starting to spread. Verse 13. David took note of these remarks and became very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So as they watched, he feigned insanity and acted like a madman on their hands, drumming on the doors of the gate and drooling onto his beard. Finally, Achish said to his servants, you see the man is mad. Why did you bring him to me? Do I not have enough madmen that you bring in this one to carry on in my presence? Should this fellow come into my house? This is all part of the routine, the setup that David has. Chapter 22. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and the rest of his family heard about it, they came down to him there. He was joined by all those who were in difficulties or in debt, or who were embittered, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. From there, David went to Mizpeh of Moab and said to the king of Moab, let my father and mother stay with you until I learn what God will do for me. He left them and the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David remained in the refuge. But the prophet Gad said to David, do not remain in the refuge. Leave and go to the land of Judah. And so David left and went to the forest of Herath. So again, all of this is being set up here for what's going to happen, where Doeg is going to betray. They're going to get into this big conflict with each other. I'm not going to go into all this in detail, but I'm going to jump ahead to verse 18. The king therefore commanded Doeg, you make the rounds and kill the priests. So Doeg the Edomite went from one to the next and killed the priest himself, slaying on that day 85 who wore the linen ephod. Saul also put the priestly city of Nob to the sword, including men and women, children and infants and oxen, asses and sheep. So again, there's this great conflict going on where the Lord calls us to peace, but Saul and Doeg are causing the violence. Verse 20, one son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to David. When Abiathar told David that Saul had slain the priests of the Lord, David said to him, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I am responsible for the death of all your family. Stay with me, fear nothing. He that seeks your life must seek my life also. You're under my protection. So now David, even though he is at risk, is reaching out to protect others. Now in chapter 23, we're going to continue to hear more about all this conflict and all these people arguing and fighting with each other, all this treachery. David continues to escape from Saul. Chapter 23, verse 25. When Saul and his men came looking for him, David got word of it, went down to the gorge in the desert below Maon. Saul heard of this and pursued David into the desert below Maon. As Saul moved along one end of the gorge, David and his men took to the other. David was in anxious flight to escape Saul, and Saul and his men were attempting to outflank David and his men in order to capture them. When a messenger came to Saul saying, "Come quickly because the Philistines have invaded the land." Saul interrupted his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. This is how that place came to be called the Gorge of Divisions. So David is now in a situation here where he's just about had it with Saul, and he has an opportunity in which he can kill him. And the Lord has presented him an amazing opportunity, and David must make a decision. Chapter 24, verse 1. David then went up from there and stayed in the refuges behind En-Gedi. And when Saul returned from the pursuit of the Philistines, he was told that David was in the desert near En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 picked men from all Israel and went in search of David and his men in the direction of the Wild Goat Crags, basically the caves. Verse 4. When he came to the sheepfolds along the way, he found a cave which he entered to ease nature. David and his men were occupying the inmost recesses of the cave. Now, this is one of those ones where I'm glad we're doing it on the computer rather than in a room full of people, because I know somebody would raise it in their hand and say, what does it mean to ease nature? Well, he went in there to relieve himself. To ease nature is the way the scripture puts it. Now, he went into this cave for a little privacy, but notice at the end of verse 4, David and his men were occupying the inmost recesses of the cave. Now, do you think Saul knew that? Not a chance. Verse 5. David's servant said to him, "This is a day of which the Lord said to you, I will deliver your enemy into your grasp. Do with him as you see fit." So David moved up and stealthily cut off an end of Saul's mantle, off of his robe. Now here is Saul in a very compromised position. David can do anything he wants, so he cuts off an end of his robe, his mantle. Verse 6. Afterward, however, David regretted that he had cut off an end of Saul's mantle. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, as to lay a hand on him, for he is the Lord's anointed." Even though David has already been anointed, he has not taken the position yet, so he still has that respect for Saul. Verse 8. With these words, David restrained his men and would not permit them to attack Saul. Saul then left the cave and went on his way. David also stepped out of the cave, calling to Saul, "My Lord King." When Saul looked back, David bowed to the ground in homage and asked Saul, "Why do you listen to those who say David is trying to harm you? You see for yourself today that the Lord has just now delivered you into my grasp in the cave. I had some thought of killing you, but I took pity on you instead. I decided I will not raise my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed and a father to me. Look here at this end of your mantle, which I hold. Since I cut off an end of your mantle and did not kill you, see and be convinced that I plan no harm and no rebellion." David is really taking the high road here. And what he's saying here is we've got to make sure that you understand what I'm about here. I've done you no wrong. Though you are hunting me down to take my life, the Lord will judge between me and you, and the Lord will exact justice from you in my case. I shall not touch you. The old proverb says, "From the wicked comes forth wickedness. So I will take no action against you." Against whom are you on campaign, O King of Israel? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog or a single flea? The Lord will be the judge. He will decide between me and you. May he see this and take my part and grant me justice beyond your reach. David is really taking the high road here, and Saul is realizing it. Verse 17. When David finished saying these things to Saul, Saul answered, "Is that your voice, my son David?" And he wept aloud. Saul then said to David, "You are in the right rather than I. You have treated me generously while I have done you harm. Great is the generosity you showed me today when the Lord delivered me into your grasp and you did not kill me. For if a man meets his enemy, does he send him away unharmed? May the Lord reward you generously for what you have done this day. And now, since I know that you shall surely be king, and the sovereignty over Israel shall come into your possession, swear to me by the Lord that you will not destroy my descendants, and that you will not blot out my name and family. David gave Saul his oath, and Saul returned home, while David and his men went up to the refuge. Saul was basically said, I'm defeated here. There's nothing I can do here. So please just respect those who come after me, my descendants. Just give me that oath. And David agreed to do so. Now, in chapter 25, we hear of the death of Samuel. Remember, Samuel, this is the person the book is named after. He is the one, the last prophet, the last judge of all of Israel. He's the one who appointed Saul as king and then anointed David as king. Well, he is going to pass away. Chapter 25, verse 1. Samuel died, and all Israel gathered to mourn him. They buried him in his home in Ramah. Then David went down to the desert of Maon. There was a man of Maon who had property in Carmel. He was very wealthy, owning 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. At this time, he was present for the shearing of his flocks in Carmel. The man was named Nabal, his wife Abigail. The woman was intelligent and attractive, but Nabal himself, a Calebite, was harsh and ungenerous in his behavior. And you'll see that in a couple minutes here. Nabal is not a good person, but his wife Abigail is wonderful. Verse 4. When David heard in the desert that Nabal was shearing his flock, he sent 10 young men, instructing them, go up to Carmel, pay Nabal a visit, and greet him in my name. Say to him, peace be with you, my brother, and with your family and all who belong to you. I have just heard that the shearers are with you. Now, when your shepherds were with us, we did them no injury, neither did they miss anything all the while they were in Carmel. Ask your servants, and they will tell you so. Look kindly on these young men, since we have come at a festival time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can manage. Well, that's not so much to ask, but Nabal will have nothing to do with it. And beginning in verse 9, he makes all of his excuses about why he won't do it. But in verse 14, Nabal's wife was informed by this, and she says, wait a second, we do need to help them. So in verse 18, Abigail quickly got together 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of pressed raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on asses. She then said to her servants, go on ahead, I will follow you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. Remember, he was the jerk, and she was the one that was really caring for the people. Well, the rest of that chapter, we hear about all the good things that Abigail has done and all the way that she has taken care of the people. Verse 32, David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me today. Blessed be your good judgment, and blessed be you yourself, who this day have prevented me from shedding blood and from avenging myself personally. Otherwise, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from harming you, if you had not come so promptly to meet me, by dawn, Nabal would have not had a single man or a boy left alive. David then took from her what she had brought him and said to her, go up to your home in peace. See, I have granted your request as a personal favor. The idea that Abigail was very kind and generous to David means that there was no conflict, no violence, no war. When verse 36, when Abigail came to Nabal, there was a drinking party in his house like that of a king, and Nabal was merry because he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all before daybreak the next morning. But then, when Nabal had become sober, his wife told him what had happened. At this, his courage died within him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck him, and he died. On hearing that Nabal was dead, David said, blessed be the Lord who has requited the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and who restrained his servant from doing evil, but has punished Nabal for his own evil deeds. David didn't have to do anything. The Lord took care of him. Continuing in verse 39, David then sent a proposal of marriage to Abigail. When David's servants came to Abigail in Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to you that he may take you as his wife. Rising and bowing to the ground, she answered, your handmaid would become a slave to wash the feet of my Lord's servants. She got up immediately, mounted an ass, and followed David's messengers, with her 5 maids following in attendance upon her. She became the wife, and David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel. Thus both of them were his wives. But Saul gave David's wife Michal, Saul's own daughter, to Palti, son of Laish, who was from Galim. Now, this is one of those things where wait a second, they've actually got 2 wives. At that time, multiple wives were very common. But what's interesting here is David is marrying Abigail. He's also married to Ahinoam. But remember, he also was married to Saul's daughter, Michal. What does Saul do? Takes his daughter away from him, to give to Palti, son of Laish, who is from Galim. Now, it's interesting because we look at that and say, well, how much say did the women have to do with this? Basically, very little. They were considered possessions of their fathers until they became possessions of their husbands. And then they just basically did what they were told. So these women really did not have much choice in the whole issue. In chapter 26, once again, Saul's life will be spared. 26, verse 1. Men from Ziph came to Saul in Gibeah, reporting that David was hiding in the hill of Hachilah at the edge of the wasteland. So again, we get into this whole idea where there's this conflict. So David has this opportunity to kill Saul again, but he doesn't. Look at verse 8. Abishai whispered to David, God has delivered your enemy into your grasp this day. Let me nail him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I will not need a second thrust. But David said to Abishai, do not harm him, for who can lay hands on the Lord's anointed and remain unpunished? It's an interesting thought here. David has respect for Saul because he's still the king or serving as the king. So how can you possibly hurt the one who is the Lord's anointed and remain unpunished? Verse 10. As the Lord lives, David continued, it must be the Lord himself who will strike him, whether the time comes for him to die or he goes out and perishes in battle. But the Lord forbid that I touch his anointed. Now take the spear, which is at his head, and the water jug, and let us be on our way. So David took the spear and the water jug from their place at Saul's head, and they got away without anyone seeing or knowing or awakening. All remained asleep because the Lord had put them into a deep slumber. What a great opportunity for David to kill King Saul. He's sound asleep. The Lord has put everybody into a deep slumber. But again, he doesn't do it. But David decides to do something else that's a little interesting here. Verse 13. Going across an opposite slope, David stood on a remote hilltop at a great distance from Abner, son of Ner, with the troops. He then shouted, will you not answer, Abner? Abner answered, who is it that calls me? David said to Abner, are you not a man whose like does not exist in Israel? Why then have you not guarded your lord the king when one of his subjects went to kill the king, your lord? This is no creditable service you have performed. As the Lord lives, you people deserve death because you have not guarded your lord, the king's anointed. Go look, where are the king's spear and the water jug that were his head? Well, they're gone. David took them once again, just like in the cave. He had an opportunity to kill him, but he didn't, but he took evidence proving that he was there and certainly could have. Verse 17. Saul recognized David's voice and asked, is that your voice, my son David? David answered, yes, Lord, my king. He continued, why does my Lord pursue his servant? What have I done? What evil do I plan? Please now, let my Lord the king listen to the words of his servant. If the Lord has incited you against me, let an offering appease him. But if men, may they be cursed before the Lord, because they have exiled me, so that this day I have no share in the Lord's inheritance. But I'm told, go serve other gods. Do not let my blood flow to the ground, far from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, as if he were hunting partridge in the mountains. Then Saul said, and this is interesting, I've done wrong. Come back, my son David. I will not harm you again, because you have held my life precious today. Indeed, I have been a fool and made a serious mistake. But David answered, here is the king's spear. Let an attendant come over to get it. The Lord will reward each man for his justice and faithfulness. Today, though, the Lord delivered you into my grasp. I would not harm the Lord's anointed. As I valued your life highly today, so may the Lord value my life highly and deliver me from all difficulties. Then Saul said to David, blessed are you, my son David. You will certainly succeed in whatever you undertake. David went on his way, and Saul returned to his home. Now, David's still wondering about what's going on with Saul, and he's very concerned and very confused about this. So he wants to make sure that he protects himself. So in almost all of chapter 27, we hear about David taking refuge among the Philistines. He goes to Ziklag, he goes all these raids and everything. And it's a whole idea of recognizing how David knows that he is at risk, even though Saul has apologized and said that he would not harm them. Chapter 28. In those days, the Philistines mustered their military forces to fight against Israel. So again, we got the Philistines, Goliath, who's dead. Philistines are still battling the Israelites. So that's chapter 28, verse 1. In those days, the Philistines mustered their military forces to fight against Israel. So Achish said to David, you realize, of course, that you and your men must go out on campaign with me to Jezreel. David answered Achish, good, now you can learn what your servant can do. Then Achish said to David, I shall appoint you as my permanent bodyguard. Verse 3, now Samuel had died. We heard that in chapter 25. Now Samuel had died, and after being mourned by all of Israel, was buried in his city Ramah. Meanwhile, Saul had driven mediums and fortune tellers out of the land. Fortune tellers and mediums were problems. They were tricking people. They were taking advantage of them. They were taking their money. They were basically making fools out of people. And so he drove them out of the land. Verse 4, the Philistine levies advanced to Shunem and encamped. Saul too mustered all of Israel. They camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was dismayed and lost heart completely. He therefore consulted the Lord, but the Lord gave no answer, whether in dreams or by the Urim or through prophets. Saul says, I'm in trouble here. I know I've abandoned you, Lord. I know I've turned away from you for my own selfish interest. I've tried to kill David. I've made his life miserable. But I've got a problem here. We got this big war with the Philistines, and they outnumber us greatly. What am I going to do? Verse 7, then Saul said to his servants, find me a woman who is a medium, to whom I can go and seek counsel through her. His servants answered him, there is a woman in Endor who is a medium. Remember, he drove them all out of the land, so they have to go to Endor to find her. Verse 8, so he disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and set out with two companions. They came to the woman by night, and Saul said to her, tell my fortune through a ghost. Conjure up for me the one I ask you to. But the woman answered him, you are surely aware of what Saul has done in driving out the mediums and fortune tellers out of the land. She's telling Saul what Saul has done because he's disguised and she doesn't recognize him. Why then are you laying snares for my life to have me killed? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, you shall incur no blame for this. Then the woman asked him, whom do you want me to conjure up? And he answered, Samuel. Verse 12, when the woman saw Samuel, she shrieked at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. But the king said to her, have no fear. What do you see? The woman answered Saul, I see a preternatural being rising from the earth. What does he look like? Asked Saul. And she replied, It is an old man who is rising, clothed in a mantle. Saul knew that it was Samuel, and so he bowed face to the ground in homage. Samuel then said to Saul, "Why do you disturb me by conjuring me up?" Now we're looking at this and saying, wait a second, is this really true? Is this really what happened here? Well, everything in the Bible is true, and everything has a message for us. And the message here is that Saul has decided to call up Samuel against the will of God, and somehow Samuel does appear to him. I wouldn't give the witch of Endor that much credit. This is all the work of God, but it's all part of God's plan. So let's go back to verse 15. Samuel then said to Saul, "Why do you disturb me by conjuring me up?" Saul replied, "I am in great straits, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has abandoned me. Since he no longer answers me through the prophets or in dreams, I've called you to tell me what I should do. God has abandoned me. I don't have any dreams. The prophets aren't speaking to me. What shall I do?" Verse 16, to this Samuel said, "But why do you ask me if the Lord has abandoned you and is with your neighbor? The Lord has done this to you, what is foretold through me. He has torn the kingdom from your grasp and has given it to your neighbor David. Because you disobeyed the Lord's directive and would not carry out his fierce anger against Amalek, the Lord has done this to you today. Moreover, the Lord will deliver Israel and you as well into the clutches of the Philistines. By tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me," meaning in the netherworld that we refer to as heaven. That time they referred to it as Sheol, the netherworld. "But tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, and the Lord will have delivered the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, for he was badly shaken by Samuel's message. Moreover, he had no bodily strength left, since he had eaten nothing all that day and night. Then the women came to Saul, and seeing that he was quite terror-stricken, said to him, "Remember, your maidservant obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and fulfilled the request you've made of me. Now, you in turn, please listen to your maidservant. Let me set something before you to eat, so that you may have strength when you go on your way." But he refused, saying, "I will not eat." However, when the servants joined the woman in urging him, he listened to their entreaties, got up from the ground, and sat on a couch. The women had a stall-fed calf in the house, which she now quickly slaughtered. Then, taking flour, she kneaded it and baked unleavened bread. She set the meal before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they stood up and left the same night. So Saul's plan did not work. Going to the medium, the witch of Endor, they were able to reach Samuel, but Samuel had nothing to offer him. Chapter 29. Now the Philistines had mustered all their forces in Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped at the spring of Harod near Jezreel. As the Philistine lords were marching their groups of 100 and 1,000, David and his men were marching in the rear guard with Achish. The Philistine chiefs asked, "What are those Hebrews doing here?" And Achish answered, "Why, that is David, the officer of Saul, king of Israel. He has been with me now for a year or two, and I have no fault to find with him, from the day he came over to me until the present." But the Philistine chiefs were angered at this and said to him, "Send that man back. Let him return to the place you picked out for him. He must not go down into battle with us, lest during the battle he become our enemy. For how else can he win back his master's favor, if not with the heads of those men of ours? Is this not the David whom they sang during their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Once again, as we heard a couple minutes ago, the reputation of David has spread. So as a result, they're going to go into this conflict. Then the conflict continues. And in chapter 30, before David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day, the Achmalites had raided the Negeb, and Ziklag had stormed the city, and they had set it on fire. They had all taken captive the women and all who were in the city, young and old, killing no one. They carried them off when they left. David and his men arrived at the city to find it burned to the ground, and their wives, sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and all who were with him wept aloud until they could weep no more. David's two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, had also been carried off with the rest. Now David found himself in great difficulty, for the men spoke of stoning him, so bitter were they over the fate of their sons and daughters. But with renewed trust in the Lord his God, David said to Abiathar, the priest, son of Ahimelech, "Bring me to the ephod." When Abiathar brought him the ephod, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue these raiders? Can I overtake them?" The Lord answered him, "Go in pursuit, for you shall surely overtake them and effect a rescue." Once again, David is putting his trust totally in the Lord. Verse 9. So David went off with his 600 men and came as far as the Wadi Besor, where those who were to remain behind halted. David continued the pursuit with 400 men, but 200 were too exhausted to cross the Wadi Besor and remain behind. An Egyptian was found in the open country and brought to David. He was provided with food, which he ate, and given water to drink. A cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of pressed raisins were also offered to him. When he had eaten, he revived. He had not taken food or drink or water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David asked him, "To whom do you belong? And where do you come from?" He replied, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me because I fell sick 3 days ago today. We raided the Negev of Sherethatz, the territory of Judah, and the Negev of Saleb, and we sent Ziklag on fire." David then asked him, "Will you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me to my master, and I will lead you to lead the raiding party." He did lead them, and there were Amalekites scattered all over the ground, eating, drinking, and in a festive mood, because all the rich booty they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. They won. They were thrilled. They have all the spoils, if you will, the women, the animals, everything they want. Verse 17, from dawn to sundown, David attacked them, putting them under the ban so that none escaped except for the 400 young men who mounted their camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, small or great, booty or sons or daughters, all of the Amalekites had taken. David brought back everything. Moreover, David took all the sheep and oxen. As they drove them before him, they shouted, "This is David's spoil." The Lord was with David. He was able to rescue everyone and free them from their captivity. Verse 21. When David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him, and whom he had left behind at the Wadi Besor, they came out to meet David and the men with him. On nearing them, David greeted them. But all the stingy and worthless men among those who had accompanied David spoke up to say, "Since they did not accompany us, we will not give them anything from the booty, except to each man his wife and children. Let them take those along and be on their way." But David said, "You must not do this, my brothers, after what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our grip the band that came against us. Who could agree with this proposal of yours? Rather, the share of the one who goes down to battle and that of the one who remains with the baggage shall be the same. They shall share alike." Very interesting thought here, like some of the parables that Jesus told, particularly those who went into work in the vineyard. Those who were hired first got paid as the same as the last. Well, David's doing the same thing here. Verse 25. And from that day forward, he made it a law and a custom in Israel, as it is still today. Verse 26. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to the elders of Judah, city by city, saying, "This is a gift to you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. To those in Bethel, to those in Rabbah-Negeb, to those in Jatir, to those in Aror, to those in Siphmoth, and to those in Eshtapanea, to those in Rascal, to those in the Jerahmeelite cities, to those in the Kenite cities, to those in Haran, to those in Barashan, to those in Atla, to those in Hebron, and to all the places frequented by David and his men. So once again, all of this is being carried out exactly as the Lord had intended. Now, the last chapter that we have in the first book of Samuel is chapter 31. Chapter 31, verse 1. As they pressed their attack on Israel, with the Israelites fleeing before them and falling mortally wounded on Mount Gilboa, the Philistines pursued Saul and his sons closely and slew Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, sons of Saul. Remember, Jonathan was so close with David, and now he has been killed by the Philistines. Verse 3, the battle raged around Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was pierced to the abdomen. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and run me through, lest these uncircumcised come and make sport of me. But his armor bearer, badly frightened, refused to do so. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul, his 3 sons, and his armor bearer died together on that same day. And again, David had nothing to do with his death. It was through this war with the Philistines. Verse 7, when the Israelites on the slope of the valley and those along the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they too abandoned their cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and lived in those cities. The day after the battle, the Philistines came to strip the slain and found Saul and his 3 sons lying on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head and stripped him of his armor, and then sent the good news throughout the land of the Philistines to their idols and to their people. They put his armor in the temple of Astarte, but impaled his body on the wall of Bashan. When the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard that what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their warriors set out. After marching throughout the night, removed the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bashan and brought them to Jabesh, where they cremated them. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted for 7 days. So this is how the first book of Samuel ends, with the death of Saul and his 3 sons. But now in the next book, we're going to continue with the kingship of King David. Well, it's just about time for us to wrap up. And so let's take a moment and bow our heads in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Good and gracious God, we continue to give you thanks for this time together. We ask that you continue to bless us and guide us in our journey of faith, particularly during this Easter season. And during this time, let us continue to pray for the people of Ukraine, all those who have died, all those who have lost loved ones, those who have been wounded, and the millions of refugees that are fleeing their homeland to foreign lands, that the Lord will enlighten the leaders of Russia to turn away from the darkness to the light of peace and justice. And loving God, I call upon your blessings on all of us here today, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, we look forward to seeing you again next week when we begin the second book of Samuel. God bless.